I'll introduce myself first while they figure out Rob's mic. So hi, I'm Ian Cartwright from Thoughtworks. I'm a tech director there. Spend a lot of my time working with clients, and I'm also part of the group that puts the tech radar together. And more recently, actually for over a year now, myself, Rob and James Lewis, we've been collaborating with some help from Martin Fowler on capturing some patterns of legacy displacement. So talking to Martin, he was saying, he was seeing a gap, saying, actually, we've discovered a lot of really interesting things about how you can get rid of legacy systems, but no one's really written those up. So he thought it would be really interesting to start capturing those on his website. So a lot of the content here is based on longer form articles that are up on Martin's site. And hopefully Rob is now... Online? No? Oh. It's normally my mic that goes wrong, not Rob's. Okay.
So I'm Rob. I'm a tech principal working for Thoughtworks as well with Ian out of our London office. And like Ian said, we've been collaborating with Martin on a series of articles in kind of preparing for this talk and also in writing the articles. I reckon I've done maybe 2/3 of my entire career has actually been traipsing through brownfield or working on legacy modernisation projects, and we're just here to kind of share some of our findings with you all today.
Yeah, so I think they're going to go and see if they can find a replacement mic for Rob, so apologies and please bear with us. If you move... Okay, so this is actually me, so hopefully by the end of this bit we'll have another mic. So we thought it would be really interesting to talk a little bit about why do legacy systems come about. And there's lots of different reasons, but just some of the common things that we've seen in our work over the years. And one of them is historically for what I would sort of describe as not non-internet native organizations. Something that happened was IT was historically a cost center. So maybe an existing organization would bring in some IT to help with payroll or start to automate some processes. But it was primarily seen as a cost center. And what we actually see is quite often that attitude still persists, or it's persisted for a very long time. And so IT wasn't seen as something that was value generating, and therefore it wasn't seen as something to invest in. And so what you got was successive waves of, we need to cut some cost. We need to take some cost out of the business. And so you wouldn't get that in investment. And so what would happen then is you'd have systems where slowly over time they're starting to stagnate because they're not being worked on, they're not being modernized. And IT, when they're going and requesting the budget, say, hey, we got a bunch of technical debt, we can't respond to the business quickly enough. The answer is, well, we don't really see that as value generating, and we're going to spend that investment money somewhere else. And ultimately, we saw a lot of organizations in the UK who then ended up outsourcing IT. And often what would happen there is the way a lot of outsourcers would win the work is sort of bid really low, but then get that money back, get that profit back on change requests. And what that ended up doing was putting up the cost of change even higher. And so what we often see now is organizations who the cost of change over time becomes prohibitive. And what happens is that we end up with a situation where the business are frustrated, or they've got ideas or things they'd like to do on the website or somewhere in the business, which when they go to IT and ask how long it would take and how much it would cost, it's prohibitive. And it's frustrating because they say, well, hold on, this is a really small change that we're asking you to do. Why are you saying it's going to take 3 months and £1 million? So it's not the only reason why we see legacy happen, but this is very common. We get this crisis point where that cost of change is starting to damage the business. The business need to get things done with IT, and the cost of change has become prohibitive. And so then the request comes, we need to get rid of legacy. And so we're going to talk about, as you guess from the title, some ways that you might do that. So how are we doing on... Okay, so we've got 4 parts effectively. So we'll talk a little bit about what we're trying to achieve. We'll talk about breaking up the problem, and we're only really going to give one example of that. That in itself could be, it is a big article on the site. It's a very complex topic, but we'll give one example there. But we think that's absolutely key. You've got to break the problem into smaller parts. Then we'll talk about delivery. So once we've thought about how we might break replacing legacy up into smaller chunks, how are we then going to deliver that?
Hello.
And we'll talk about how we can do that in an incremental way. And then we'll touch upon organizational transformation. We're not going to try and talk about organizational transformation today, but we'll talk about why you can't ignore that when you're doing legacy displacement. And we have another mic.
Talking in a more calm voice. Awesome. So why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve when we're looking at modernizing legacy? And if you ask me, that's sort of like pretty obvious, right? It should be pretty obvious. But if you ask different stakeholders across your organization why and what they're trying to get out of it, you're going to get different answers. So you need to get alignment with those stakeholders. Often I'm just going to boil down to money, right? In a lot of cases. So if you want to generate revenue and you've got an increasing kind of cost of change, that's going to stop you from innovating. It's going to stop you from launching new products. So we need to do something about that. Equally, it might be about operation efficiency. Yeah, so you want to do more with less. In which case, you're not able to modernize or change your business processes, again, because the business is shackled by this software, which costs a fortune to change. The other option, or the other story here is, again, it's around risk, essentially. I was recently working with a client who's they have $1 billion revenue generating kind of system. And they were running that software on completely out of support middleware, right? That actually represents a real significant risk to their business. So when we asked IT stakeholders, why are we doing this? It's about being able to operate our business without reliance on this hugely risky middleware. If you ask the team more in the business, actually their answer, the same project, was we have some critical issues that we need sorting out in the flow and how we sell products that's costing us revenue. And we need to be able to innovate. We want to be able to change. We want to try and experiment, but we can't because of the cost of change is so high. So yeah, step one, right? Let's get alignment, working with your stakeholders on what it is we're trying to achieve. So when we're thinking about replacing a legacy system, so that this out of support software, that scenario is very typically IT-led. It's seen as a technology challenge, right? You've got this piece of middleware, this software that's out of support. To put something new in we'll just do that from the bottom up. Okay, I'm kind of operating my business. I've got 2 or 3 change programs that are already going on, and my people have got change fatigue. Like, I really can't deal with another change program, a transformation program, but I need to get rid of this middleware. So what do, right? My business isn't broken now, so let's not fix it. So I'll just have the system as it does what it does now, right? But actually in new technology. And that's a bit of a trap, right? Now, I actually thought, sorry, if there's anyone here from the UML police, right? I'm really sorry. I got a bit loose and sort of fly with the old UML diagrams. And I thought no one would be able to read it anyway, right? Because it's on a slide. It's flipping 20 foot tall. Anyway, right. So, if you are going to do feature parity, it can work. But it's all about scope and what is in your scope. Well, you have all of the UI, the menus, the screens, the functions that your users use. You have all your batch process, all your integrations, your algorithms, and of course, don't forget your reports and all your data, some data migration, that kind of stuff. So to make sure that you literally are doing a like for like, all of that stuff needs to be tested and proven. You're probably going to need to do a whole load of archaeology to actually figure out what the total scope of this system is. So it's not to be underestimated, right? It's really hard. Equally, at the same time, you have all these defects, and you probably have a whole load of unused features as well. So do you really want to be migrating that stuff or reproducing that stuff into your new system? Chances are, and we hear this again and again, that actually the last thing the business want is a system that they have now, right? They've been crying for ages to get off of this platform. So yeah, feature parity is a pattern. We see it a lot when you're starting bottom up, and it's a technology-led project. But it is a trap, and the other trap is it can kind of tend to lead to a binary situation. It's replace A with B, and that can lead us onto our next kind of pattern. which is around Big Bang releases.
Cool, thanks, Rob. So I think if I were to, chat to any of you over a coffee, we'd probably agree that Big Bang releases on the whole are a bad thing. But it's amazing how often we see these legacy replacement programs end up in that situation, especially when they go the feature parity route. Because what we tend to do is also, what comes into scope is all the dependencies and all the other systems and all the legacy databases we might need to migrate the data across. And there's a bunch of reasons that come together that feature parity, not always, but almost always ends up as a Big Bang release. And there's a couple of problems with that, which I'm probably... How many people have been involved in a Big Bang release, by the way? Keep your hand up if you found it completely stress-free. Yeah, I didn't. So I can't see any hands. So it's what it does. It pushes all the risks to the very end. Especially when we're dealing with integration, what we really want is to test those things early and find out, is this integration working? Is my data migration working? How long will the data migration take? Have I got a bunch of cleanup to do on my legacy data because it was generated 20 years ago and my new system has all these new constraints in the database, etc., and etc. So there's all these reasons why doing Big Bang becomes really scary. And it tends to... The way people do it is what we call the stop the world. So basically, Friday, 3 p.m. or whatever, log out of all the systems, everybody stops processing orders and doing stuff, and then everyone goes home for the weekend, and then hopefully you all come in on Monday, and if they've done feature parity, as far as the users are concerned, it looks exactly the same, but hey presto, it's on the new, more reliable technology. And you can see at that point why the business might not feel like they've got a lot for their money at that point, because it's, well, hold on, it looks the same. But IT is saying, well, don't worry, honestly, it is more reliable. And then here's the other thing that we keep seeing getting forgotten. Almost always when people build the business case for legacy replacement, one of the things that the business is saying is, we want faster changes, and we want better time to market, and we want lower costs for those changes. And how do we know if we're getting that? Well, we'll talk more about it later on, but the problem with Big Bang is you have no way of validating that you can release the software more often because you end up with a 6 or a 12 or an 18-month project. And the problem that we see happen is at the end of that period, the business is going, great, because in the business case, you said every 2 weeks, once we've got the new system, every 2 weeks. And you've spent 18 months training everybody that you're going to release software every 18 months. And so you're lucky if the next release comes 6 months or maybe even 10 months later. And this is something else that we see. That part of the business case, when you do Big Bang, it just gets left. It's very, very hard to transition from releasing every year to releasing every 2 weeks. It's almost impossible to do that. Thanks, Rob. Okay, so we want to talk... as we said, about breaking up the problem, and this is absolutely key. One of the things we often hear is when people start to look at, say, replacing a big mainframe or a large legacy application with a very big monolithic database attached to it, it's very hard. You're looking at that, you go, oh, we have no idea how we can break that up. And we've seen organizations repeatedly fail to find a way to slice the problem up, and they end up back at feature parity, and they end up back at Big Bang. So we're not saying it's easy. We don't have a silver bullet. There aren't any silver bullets, but we think collaborating with the business, sitting down and trying to find ways of breaking up the problem is worth doing. It's difficult. If you get this bit right, a lot of the other things will fall into place, but this is where the brain power and the collaboration is really needed. So it would be a whole different talk, and on Martin's sites, we've got some articles that we're adding to all the time. So I'm just going to give one example here of how we might break the problem up, and this is a real-world thing that we did. Working with a retailer, everything's running on a mainframe, a lot of legacy systems sitting in the back end. They have a legacy logistics, and pretty much everything's ended up in the mainframe. And they wanted a way to do a staged release, because the problem they had was I always get this wrong, is it Black Wednesday or Black Friday? You can tell I'm not much of a shopper. Anyway, and they had Christmas coming up. And so they felt like we need ways to prove this out. We need ways to demonstrate we're on the right path before then. And Big Bang is just too risky for our business. So what we actually did is we sat down with the IT people and the business people, and we got the people from the finance team in the room with us. when they were like, why do you want to talk to finance? You're meant to be talking about replacing a legacy system. So, well, they're the people who can help us understand which of the product lines generate the most revenue, because that might be a way we can slice the problem up. And that's actually what we did with this particular client. We said, actually, what we could do is look at different user cohorts, different product lines, and maybe migrate ladies' sportswear onto a new site, onto a new set of systems first. And then we could bring maybe men's sportswear over, and then we can move gardening goods over, and so on. And we gave us a way to slice the problem up. But we had to bring the business along with us, because we needed to get that in the right order. Let's not do the first thing. Let's not make it the most risky, highest revenue, but let's make it meaningful, something meaningful to the business. We also needed their buy-in, because it was going to create some disparity. So if somebody was on the new site and they ended up going back to the old site, they might have a different user experience. And so we needed the business buy-in that they were okay with that happening. So you really got to get everybody in the room together to make this stuff work. The one other thing I'd mention really quick there is we discovered some things that they lost money on. So we found some of these product lines, they didn't make any money from them, so we just end-of-lifed them. We didn't spend the time and money to migrate them because they didn't make the money any business. It's amazing how often people miss that.
And so your product lines is one way, right? But there are many, many other ways that you can sort of split up these problems. And that's where, does anyone kind of like self-identify as an architect or a technical leader, designer? Okay, right, cool. So essentially, this is where you earn your big bucks, right? This is where you bring all your tools to bear on the problem of trying to figure out how we can break this problem up. So other places you can go looking, Ian mentioned the product lines. A client I've previously been working with looked at user cohorts. So different kind of sets of groups of users and migrating features that those users needed incrementally. You could look at different business capabilities. You could look at a user journey, getting finer grained, right? You could look at a user journey and do journey by journey. You could look at parts of a user journey. So another typical one might be your shopping cart or your payment kind of checkout at the end of a process. You can, take slices. There's loads of different places that you can look at. So I would say, like, products is one, users another, as well as technical seams as well. That is something we're going to talk about just sort of in a moment. So once we've figured out how we might break this problem up, we now need to actually deliver the parts, right? You can't just, right? This is kind of step one, is to break it up. How do we go about delivering the parts? Now, kind of a pattern that Martin talked about many years ago now, actually on his website, was the strangler vine pattern. Is anyone kind of familiar with or heard of that as like an approach? Okay, right, so it's kind of like introducing a facade of some kind, and then using that as a level of indirection to then create new implementations of your application, gradually moving across features over time until essentially your new application has strangled the life out of your legacy system and you're no longer reliant on it. But it's kind of a bit of a meta pattern, really, right? So sort of super high level, but how do you kind of actually go about doing a kind of a strangler vine implementation? So yeah, as I just talked about, we'll get rid of it over time. One of the main patterns that we're seeing teams kind of calling out and talking about in a specific way is this sort of idea of event interception. So this is like one of the main enablers for your sort of strangler strategy. So what are we kind of talking about here? We're essentially, different technologies are going to enable you to essentially intercept and process events in different ways. So if you have kind of messaging infrastructure or kind of asynchronous processing in your application, happy days. That's like a nice easy win, low-hanging fruit there, right? And there's loads of really well-documented patterns, such as like in the Patterns of Enterprise Integration work, that is like really well-known and relatively easy. But again, you need to kind of be creative and go looking for other ways that you can intercept patterns. So your integrations and APIs, another kind of quite easy place where you can put in a level of indirection. But What about in the front end? So kind of you could do micro front ends. You could kind of build out and replace parts of an application piecemeal within a front end. You could use some like progressive enhancement as well to actually override behavior of an existing front end with kind of minimum sort of light touch. You could start looking into your databases, right? So whether this is event interception or generating events on the back end after data is being updated. We're seeing a lot of teams using CDC type approaches, right? Where that's change data capture. So when a database is updated, you're actually able to generate a kind of an update event off of the back of that. You can transform that into something a bit more business meaningful. And then you can kind of process that downstream. So there's loads of different places you can go looking for events to intercept and then start kind of doing different behavior off of the back of them. And then as your architecture evolves, you're going to end up in a situation where you have old world legacy software talking to new components. And in a lot of cases, you'll find yourself having conversations along the lines of, we kind of need to update that piece of data to keep the lights on or to keep things working. In that kind of situation, we're talking about it now in terms of like a legacy mimic, right? So this is about essentially that part of the contract between your old world and your new world, where the new world is either pretending to behave exactly as the old world used to, or maybe it's consuming or updating sort of data in the same way that the old world used to as well. So back to the kind of strangler pattern, essentially there where we have, we put a kind of like a front end in, we're going to end up with a mimic that's maybe presenting the same API as a legacy component. So an old front end can continue to talk to that, so it's part of like a facade. Whereas also in the back end, you might be updating the state of an old legacy component, keeping the lights on so that maybe kind of reports or such like continue to work, even though the record of truth is actually going to become part of this new component. So something else to kind of add to the vocabulary as you're migrating from legacy to new.
Cool, thanks, Rob. So when we were writing up some of these patterns, there was one thing I just kept struggling with, and good advice is always from Martin. We're very lucky to have his help. He said, well, what you need to do is describe that thing separately and then describe the pattern. And so that's what I'm going to do. So what we see in many organizations with legacy systems is there's a set of reports that are generated that are used to basically run the business. Actually, reality is normally what's happening. They're being extracted out and somebody's having to put them into a spreadsheet and munge them into a different format because the legacy system can't actually produce the format that the board or the CEO needs. But that's a whole different story. But what happens is, if you move on, Rob, is we often see that you end up with this aggregation logic that's happening, say, inside of a mainframe. And almost always what's happening is this logic is reaching directly into database tables, into various source systems. It's aggregating this all together and it's producing a set of reports that are really important. And these are things that have to keep being available all the way through. And so we've sort of written that up as a separate pattern because it was something that we kept referring to because we see it so often with legacy. So it's this idea of a critical aggregator. And critical is because the product of the aggregator is critical to the functioning of the business. It might be the revenue report across all the stores. It might be the stock levels. It might be outstanding invoices, something like that, that's really critical to the business. And it's happening in a way that is, unfortunately, create a lot of tight coupling. So you often get this situation where people say, well, I can't add a column to that legacy database, so we can't change the format because we will break some of these reports, or more honestly, because we don't actually understand how they're generated anymore. But so there's this idea of a critical aggregator that we wanted to mention. So Rob, if we move on, so here's another implementation pattern that we've seen. What happens with these critical aggregators is almost always because especially because the consumers are often very important stakeholders or on the board or very senior management. There's a real fear around interrupting that because, they're going to be annoyed, and also it's going to impact the business. And so what often happens is they get left to last. And so you end up with this situation all the way through your legacy migration, you're having to keep these old reports running all the way through. And it becomes a real more and more difficult because you have to use lots of legacy mimics or something like that to keep pushing data into that part of the legacy system. You have to replicate all the data that was in those legacy database tables in order to keep the critical aggregator functioning all the way through. And so one thing that we found, Rob, if you move on, that's really useful. So if you've got that situation, if you go on one more, then do it first. Actually say, if that's got to function all the way through and you run the business, don't do it last. Do it right at the beginning. And actually create a new reporting function. Maybe it's an opportunity to improve the UX and make it even better, but do it right at the very beginning. And then over time, as these, A, B, C, and D move over, that functionality moves into the new system, into the replacement for legacy, it can then feed the new reporting functionality. So it sounds really obvious, but it's something that we haven't seen very often. We certainly do see the case where people say, we can't touch that, that's too scary, that's too difficult, leave it to the very end. And unfortunately, one of the things we often see with legacy replacement is you never actually turn the old system off. You sort of get caught about 60, 70% of the way, and it's stuff like this that ends up still on that legacy system. So this is one way, if you've got those sorts of things, of avoiding it, which is bite the bullet, do it right at the very beginning. Then we can parallel run. We can compare the output of the old and the new. We can do that even for a period of months, and we can just be very sure that we've got something that is safe. And then, as we say, we can move the users across. So that's divert the flow. Cool. A very similar one, this idea, and it's that's something we've seen a lot. That's why these things are here. It's something called revert to source. So we've worked with quite a lot of clients that when they're talking about legacy, there seems to be it's almost like there's a "Here be dragons" sign in front of the mainframe or the legacy monolith, where no one wants to go and look behind the covers. And so the mainframe or that legacy system becomes seen as the single source of truth. But if you actually go and look where that data comes from, it's often not coming from the legacy system. So we work with a very large, one of the world's largest retailers, where the reporting that the business owners was getting was out of date, it was very patchy, there was key information that was missing, and it was really, really puzzling. And we actually then we finally sort of tracked down, it was coming in to the mainframe from the store management system, which talked to the tills. And then when we talked to the people who own that software, they'd actually spent millions of dollars putting in a new till system that captured really rich, great, up-to-date information. But when they sent it into the mainframe, they had to throw most of it away because the mainframe didn't have anywhere to put it, because they couldn't change the format of the database, as we talked about earlier, and it had to run on an overnight batch. Whereas the till management system could actually send, if they'd wanted to, they could have gone near real time every transaction. I mean, that was actually more often than they needed. So in that situation, if you could move on, Rob, we basically said, build a new stock repository, API facade, if you like, and then build new stock management on top of that, and go directly to the source systems. And again, you might say, well, that's really obvious. Why would you take that data from the mainframe? But again, we just keep seeing it where folks don't go and trace where the data actually came from. They just assume, because everyone behaves in the organization like the mainframe or legacy is a single source of truth, they don't really understand where the data is coming from. And on the article for this, we actually describe some patterns and techniques and workshops that you can do that can help you track down where data is really coming from. So again, this sounds really obvious, but we found it extremely useful, and it seems to get missed quite often. Cool.
I'm going to talk about this other pattern now, transitional architecture. And this is one that it's there, it's obvious, it's in your face, but I think it's also kind of like hidden in plain sight, an implication of the approach that we're advocating. We've talked about how to break a problem up into pieces and then how to kind of implement those pieces over time incrementally, right? So when you start out, again, this was not necessarily a diagram I was envisaging being 20 foot high, right? So you may start out with your big red monolith, right, your legacy, and you're going to have some vision, some kind of technical vision, high-level vision of your future architecture. Okay, now it's like it is a vision, it's not a prediction of the future. Okay, so we're going to evolve towards it, and it might change as we go, but nonetheless, we're going to start with some vision of the future. Now, as we kind of implement our first pieces, we talked about like using patterns like legacy mimic and others. So we're going to have these other kind of components that are in there and some other interactions that are going on that just have no place in our end state or our vision of the end state, right? So what are these bits and pieces, and what's their longevity? Are they going to endure? And the kind of answer is like, no, they're not. We're going to throw them away. Yeah, we're going to put these components in. And like Heinrich, I loved Heinrich's talk this morning. And he was talking about prototyping, right? Kind of in a design context, how to quickly ideate on ideas and build prototypes to test out design thinking. And he said something that I wrote down and put straight into my speaker notes, right? And he said that those prototypes are not waste, but they're the cost of learning. Okay, now in the same way, these components, this scaffolding that we're putting up, and these components that enable us to work incrementally, the fact we're throwing them away, that's not waste, right? That's the cost of safety. That's the cost of options and being able to do things in different order. It's the cost of risk mitigation. And ultimately, it's the cost of that kind of incremental delivery approach. But what's like really important is you do need to throw them away. Okay, so I've worked with a couple of teams where we've been putting in these kind of components, and over time, they've actually, there's kind of anti-corruption layers, there's adapters, there are these mimics that are keeping the lights on and injecting software. It's all in production, it's all production quality, it's all part of the monitoring and alerting. There's a lot of invested energy and time and money in building this stuff. And there's been a real reluctance to throw it away. But it's essentially accidental complexity and technical debt that if you do get rid of it, your cognitive load goes down and kind of it's much easier to then kind of continue to then maintain the software. So we kind of talk about these components that we're building to give us options. We talk about them as transitional architecture. So that scaffolding, and say, underline it, you will need to throw them away. But it is the cost of essentially working safely.
Okay, so we're going to talk briefly now, quite quickly, about organizational transformation, but why it matters. Why are they talking about organizational transformation when they're meant to be telling us about legacy? So one of the first things, I mentioned Big Bang at the very beginning, and as I said, almost always, if you actually go and read the business case, and look at the return on investment, there's almost always something in there around what the business want. The business actually, the fact that we've replaced a bunch of old tech is a means to an end to them. They're probably thinking, well, hopefully the cost will come down and hopefully we won't have as much risk. But they're going to have a shopping list, especially with legacy, and almost always on there is faster time to market, lower cost of change. And so how do you ensure that at the end of your legacy replacement, that will be in place? And as I said with Big Bang, the problem with Big Bang is if you don't have a release for 6 or 12 or 18 or however long it takes, and the thing with these feature parity, the scope tends to grow as we uncover more and more functionality, is you're training people to do the exact opposite. You've got a bunch of teams and you're saying, you know what, the release is way off out there until all of a sudden it's next week. But anyway, you're training people to release software infrequently in very big increments. And so how do you avoid that? How do we ensure that we're able to say to our colleagues in the business, yes, you're going to get a solution that we can release every 2 weeks safely. And you're going to get a solution where the cost of change is going to be much lower. And the only way, if anybody else has figured out a clever way of doing this, please come and tell us. But the only way we've seen is to build the software that way all the way through. Because that's our, if you like, our existence proof. We prove we can do it by doing it. And we release every 2 weeks. So maybe some of that might not be customer facing for quite a long time because we haven't accrued enough functionality to entice people away from the legacy platform just yet. But nonetheless, we want those engineering disciplines, we want those practices in place all the way through. And so when people say, we've been asked to come in and assess long-running, large legacy programs, and often they'll have a change board and they'll have lots of complex methodology that's all about trying to ensure that they're going to get these benefits. And they'll do code analysis and all sorts of clever stuff. But in the end, it's guessing. They don't really know that at the end, when they finally press the big red button, is that software going to be in a state where we can update it on a regular basis? And unfortunately, almost always the answer is no. So build as you mean to carry on. Now, when we did this talk before, someone came to us and said, yeah, but that's just how you build software anyway. And we're like, well, yeah, you're right. But for some reason, when it comes to legacy replacement, there seems to be a blind spot. And perhaps it's because it's so hard to do that initial breaking up of the problem. But we see organizations who perhaps are doing some really good agile delivery, but who have ended up approaching their legacy replacement as a big bang program. So build as you mean to carry on, basically.
And tech is only half the problem. There's nothing soft about software delivery. It's really hard, mostly. And there's certainly nothing easy about legacy modernization. And you're going to fail completely if you haven't got access to the business and you haven't got access to your stakeholders, right? So you need to work with your stakeholders. You need to get alignment on the why and the measures of success. So back to the beginning, are we doing this because the business is shackled and unable to innovate, unable to change, unable to respond to market conditions? Is the software that they're running their business on actually representing an existential threat to them? Okay, if that's the case, that's not good, right? Got to do something about it. Is it representing real, tangible risk? So we need to get alignment on the objectives. We need to try to avoid the temptation to be a purely technology-led program. I kind of have this hypothesis that the fastest way to replace a legacy system has got to be equal to the fastest path to building a viable alternative that you can operate your business on. Right? Now we know how to build product really quickly, right? Using all of our really great top-down, user-driven and kind of user-centric design processes, right? We know how to do that. So can we not apply, why do we have this sort of blind spot when it comes to legacy modernization and we immediately want to go bottom up? So you need to try and rethink that. And as Ian said as well, we need to start as we intend to carry on. We need to get that proof from the start that we can incrementally deliver and continue to do so when we finally kind of break out of project or program mode into BAU. Because if we can continually update and continually change software, maybe we won't have legacy at all.
So building on that, I think one thing I find really interesting about legacy systems, and perhaps controversially, I'm going to include data warehouses in there. We've sort of not mentioned it, but actually almost always data warehouses get pulled into scope on legacy replacement. Is when you're running a system that's 10 years old or 20 years old, if you think about the pace of technology, that's a constraint you're imposing on your business that the startup or the competitor doesn't have to have if they can go and build in the cloud. And the technology is moving so quickly that if you're holding your business back with 20-year-old technology, that is an enormous burden to be carrying around. And there's something around what is it about the behavior, and I touched on it earlier, the behaviors within an organization that's led to that lack of investment. And something that's really important with legacy, and again, I've spent quite a lot of my career going in and assessing programs, and quite often it's the reason they've asked us to come in and assess the program is because it's the second or third time they've tried and it's going wrong again. And there's a sort of a really tough choice here. Because what they'll say is, well, we tried to replace it with, Java. Oh, it didn't work. Well, the problem must have been that we chose Java, so we'll try and replace it with C#. Oh, it's not worked. The problem must be that we chose C#. So what we need to do is, if you just pick a different technology, we'll be successful next time. And the problem is that's not why they're failing. If you take the same set of people, same set of processes and motivations, and the same behaviors from leaders, and change the tech, why would you expect a different outcome? The logical thing would be expect to get exactly the same outcome. And unfortunately, some organizations have discovered this the hard way, that they take the same processes, the sort of big heavyweight things and change boards and perhaps their attitude to costing IT projects and methodologies that they used from 10 years ago, and they apply them and they'll end up with the same result. So this is a tough one, and quite often, like I say, when we go in and talk to clients about legacy and we say, can we get business stakeholders in the room? Can we get the CFO in the room? Can we get the finance team? They're, why do you want to talk to them? Because the tech is only half the problem. If you think about a business and how business processes evolve, and maybe if you've got legacy systems, this might be worth going back and having a look at, is how many of your business processes that you have today look the way they do because of constraints of the systems you run them on top of. And this is back to feature parity again. You cannot separate, if you've got a legacy system that's been in place for 5, 10, or even a couple of years, you can't think about the business processes that you run on top of that system independently of the system, because the bugs, the constraints, the workarounds, especially if you've not been able to change the legacy tech, which probably is the case because that's why you want to replace it, then it's been constraining the business. There'll be all these workarounds, and there'll be the off-system working, which we haven't touched upon, but that's another key thing that when you do feature parity or when you try and break the problem up, you'll suddenly discover that half the business is being run on a spreadsheet. We had one client where they'd see these weird spikes in revenue on a Friday. The reason was that one of the teams, on a Monday, they'd download all the legacy data into an Access database. For obvious reason, I'm not going to tell you who this was. They'd run the business on, that part of the business was run on an Access database to Friday. And on Friday, they uploaded the data back into the mainframe when they do the reports. And so you've got to take account of that. You've got to think about how has the constraints the legacy IT has imposed on the organization shaped the current business processes. So that's, again, why this tech's only half the problem. You've got to think about both of those things. Cool. So thank you very much.